If anyone was in any doubt about why we still need to discuss the question of sexism in the system, just take a glance at anything that's happened this year, really, because we started in January with the inauguration of Donald Trump, a man who basically thinks it's fine to go around saying he grabs women by the pussy and then gets elected to the presidency of the most powerful state in the world. I'm sure many of us were on the women's marches and the other anti-Trump protests at the beginning of this year. A few months later, our own Prime Minister, Theresa May, called her disastrous general election, and she, who a few years ago was photographed wearing a T-shirt that says "This is what a feminist looks like," by the way, and I'll come back to that. But as soon as she realised that she'd lost her majority, instantly puts the call out to the DUP, a bigoted, nasty right-wing party in Northern Ireland, which absolutely denies women the right to abortion, which is homophobic, which is bigoted in all the ways you can count, including, obviously one of the central questions in Irish history. And then we've ended the year, over the autumn, with the whole question of sexual harassment and assault coming to the fore, rightly being talked about much more widely in society, starting with the Harvey Weinstein exposure, really. Sorry, that's an unfortunate word. The fact that, lots and lots of women started to come out and talk about the experiences that they'd had at his, with Harvey Weinstein over many, many years. And suddenly it all falls away and it becomes very, very clear that he's absolutely a predatory bully, and a bully in a general sense, as well as being a sexual bully of young women trying to get on in Hollywood. And that was followed, of course, by revelations about all kinds of other people, other Hollywood figures, stars, Tory cabinet members, other MPs, and more, really just being exposed as serial harassers of women, but also sometimes of young men and of people who have less power than them, basically, in society. And it's been really vile to see the way that the right-wing media has, and some of the establishment, have straight away tried to minimise these experiences. So when the stuff was coming out about some of our MPs here in Britain, it was all like, it's just a hand on the knee, why does that matter? And all this kind of minimising and poo-pooing of the idea that creating an atmosphere in which it's apparently considered acceptable to just, grab parts of women's bodies or make sexual comments to them, and so on. This kind of annoyance from the right-wing media and some of the establishment that this should be considered a problem. And I think, on the one hand, we've got the very serious allegations, the allegations of rape and sexual harassment and so on, and assault, which obviously aren't restricted to Hollywood or to Parliament, and which go much, much broader in society. We also had then the Me Too campaign, where millions of women, really, mostly women, also men, tweeted about their experiences of harassment, sometimes on a much smaller scale, in terms of the kind of everyday sexism type stuff, comments in the street and so on. And it's a bit of it feels like a bit of a turning point. Not that harassment has necessarily got worse or the situation is worse than it used to be, but that it's become exposed, it's become something that people are more prepared to talk about and not prepared to put up with. And that's a fantastically positive thing. And this is something that's been happening for a few years in different ways. There's been, shifts around this question for a while. So a few years ago, I think it was in 2011, it started a whole series of protests around the world called Slut Walks, after this policeman went into a university in Canada to give a talk about women's safety, and one of the pieces of advice he gave was that women shouldn't dress like sluts, and then they'd be safer. And so quite rightly, students at that university, I think it was in Toronto, organised a protest against the idea that if a woman is assaulted, that it's anything to do with how she was dressed or that it's in any way her responsibility. And that caught on, really, and there were protests all around the world, including here in London. And so again, that's, quite a serious question that's been raised about who's to blame for sexual harassment, for sexual assault, and so on. And then I think beyond that, there's been the wider discussions more generally about the experience of oppression on an everyday basis. So stuff like the Everyday Sexism Project doesn't just look at things like that we would actually define as assault or harassment, but at the more kind of unconscious level of behaviour that is, the ways that we kind of exhibit our gender roles in society, if you like. So the stuff like, these new popular terms like mansplaining and manspreading and stuff that is about the way that men are socialised in society and the way that women are, which tends to lead to a situation where men tend to be more confident in the public sphere or feel that they should take up more space, and women tend to feel less confident and tend to be more quiet or tend to feel that they're meant to take up less space somehow. All of these kind of things. Now, I think it's important to say there's a big difference between, being sexist, being an overt kind of harasser, making comments to people and so on, and unconsciously displaying the kind of gender role that you've been raised in. And I don't think we should conflate the two things, if you see what I mean, in terms of how we talk about women's oppression in society. But I think it's very interesting that all of this is coming out. And I think part of the reason that questions around sexism are so big now comes out of the contradiction of the time that we live in, where so much has changed for women over the last few decades, and women are undeniably a permanent half of the workforce in this country. Even women with young children are more likely to work than not these days. Of course, not always about some positive choice, often about necessity of needing two incomes or needing one income if you're a single parent, and so on. But, clearly expectations about what women can do have expanded. Women are tending to have fewer children or having them later. Girls do well at school, go on to higher education, etc., etc. In lots of ways, men's and women's lives are much more similar than they used to be 40 or 50 years ago. But at the same time, these backward attitudes seem to keep reasserting themselves. And in some ways, I think it feels that things have gone backwards since, if people were around in the 70s when there was the last big wave of movements, and in particular the women's liberation movement here and elsewhere around the globe, the kind of post-68 period, there was a massive shift then, I think, in terms of attitudes. And really, ever since the 90s, people have been talking about a backlash against that. And, and it doesn't just apply in terms of women's liberation, but in terms of lots of things. That the big struggles of the 68 generation pushed things forward in all kinds of ways, changed all kinds of attitudes, made possible a situation where you can have women prime ministers and black presidents and all the rest of it, but at the same time, there's something underlying about how the system works that keeps reasserting itself. And I think that's partly behind why there's this kind of new discussion around women's oppression. Because why? Why is it that these attitudes still exist? Of course, the media is something to do with it, in terms of the kind of images we see, pornography, etc., all of that is very true, that these images shape how girls and women feel about themselves and feel like they're meant to act or meant to look. But where do those images come from? The media doesn't just create them randomly on a whim. They represent something. And I think beneath, the kind of the veneer of like images that we see around us, there's a very clear reality about women's role in society. And I do think it's worth coming back to the question of work and how the system, capitalism, functions, really. Because, as I said, women are half the workforce, and legally speaking, we've had equal pay for 47 years, but in practice, we don't have equal pay. We know that there's still a large pay gap, something like 18%. For full-time work. And over a lifetime, a woman will still earn something like half of what a man will earn, and that's primarily because of her role as the carer, and that is what is still still the case. Even though women work, they're also still expected to be the main carers in society. So many women will have to stop working for a period of time or work part-time because they're caring for children, but also caring for their parents, other relatives that need help, and so on, because it's this general role that women are expected to play. And that, I think, shapes all of us, whether or not we're actually in a family setting ourselves, whether we have children ourselves, and so on. I think it shapes how women's expectations are and what we're, how we feel in terms of our place in the world. So I want to say that that sexism is not about individual attitudes or about some kind of eternal human nature. I think there's another argument, isn't there? This kind of, there's men's brains and women's brains and we're all different, and that kind of thing, and it's always been that way. And I'm not going to go through all of those arguments because they're really ridiculous, but there's some really good books that have come out recently. There's a new one called Testosterone Rex by, I've forgotten her name, Cordelia Fine, Delusions of Gender, Deborah Cameron's Myth of Mars and Venus. There's lots of good science which can debunk some of the bad science which tries to prove that somehow there's, men are from Mars and women are from Venus and they're never going to meet. When men are from Earth, women are from Earth, we have to deal with that and get on, really. And I think that if we reject that, then that's useful. And I think we talk about structural oppression of women. But that in itself isn't enough either, because what structures are we talking about? I think lots of people at the moment, lots of feminists and others who campaign over women's liberation, would identify a structure as patriarchy. And I think when you look at the world, you can absolutely see how the idea of rule by men seems to describe the society that we live in. Because yes, we have Theresa May and Angela Merkel, but they're still exceptions, really. Still tiny numbers of women at the top. And, so it feels like a common sense description of the world that we live in. But I don't think that in itself, just describing the world explains how it got that way or why it's that way or why it's still that way. Some feminists would say that it is in men's nature to be aggressive and dominant. If women ruled the world, we wouldn't have all this war and economic crisis, and these kind of arguments. Again, I don't think that's a very serious argument. It's really just the Mars and Venus one put the other way around, that women are better because they're caring and nice and peaceful and, and so on. I think other people see patriarchy as an ideology, a set of ideas that goes back to the Bible or other kind of, these kind of ideas over the last few thousand years, which justifies men's rule, which is carried through the institutions of the state and the family, which are organised in this very hierarchical way. And so you can look at a family structure and see how it mirrors the kind of structure of society where, the children are at the bottom of the family, the father at the top, and the woman in between somewhere. Again, I think that's a better explanation, but it still doesn't explain why it emerged in the first place. It leaves this question hanging, really. And I think the crucial conclusion also of both of those ideas of patriarchy is that somehow it leads to the idea that all men are agents of patriarchy and all women are the victims of it. That it's almost seen as this kind of, this divide where the oppressing class is men and the oppressed class is women. But I think what that doesn't do, or doesn't allow us to do, is recognise the class division among women, for example, when we're talking about women's oppression. I mean, I mentioned Theresa May. She's someone who is in a very different position in society in terms of actual power. I don't mean, Foucauldian power or whatever. I mean actual power as part of the establishment compared to, a working class woman in, a poor part of London or anywhere else in the country. There are the small numbers of women who are at the top of the big corporations, people like Sheryl Sandberg, who wrote the book Lean In. Look at me, I'm a brilliant businesswoman, I'm rich, I've got 7 children or whatever it is. She's got, all this kind of success. If you just lean in, if you just demand more as women, then you can get to the same position as me. Or Marissa Mayer, who was the Chief Executive Officer of Yahoo until a couple of years ago. She actually got that job while she was pregnant. And so she was this kind of heavily pregnant, youngish woman who was now the CEO of a major corporation, which was held up as a brilliant example for other women. And in lots of ways, of course, it is. It's great to see more women at the top. But what did Marissa Mayer do? What did her position allow her to do? Well, she was pregnant when she got the job. When she had the baby, she had a nursery built next to her office so that she could bring the baby to work, keep it in there with an entourage of helpers, and then she could pop in and see it, feed it, give it a cuddle during the day, go back to her office and go back to work. At the same time, she banned flexible working for the other workers in Yahoo in the office, so they couldn't actually arrange to go and pick up their kids or spend time with them before bed. And I think we have to recognise the difference between being a woman who, yes, absolutely, still faces oppression, still faces the sexism and the comments and the, potential assault and all the rest of it that any woman does, but who actually is able to, firstly, is able to ameliorate some of the worst effects of some aspects of oppression. So, for example, being able to afford to have childcare, etc., to take off some of the burden of the caring role. But also, when you think about other issues, ruling class women and rich women have always been able to access safe abortions, whether or not it's legal. It's easier if it's legal, but if you've got money, you can still access it. Think of all kinds of other services that women need that rich women have always been able to get. Now, rich women, of course, will want equal rights in a capitalist society, the right to own property, the right to divorce, the right, all kinds of rights which all women should have, but the right to own property is a bit of a different thing if you've actually got some property to own, as opposed to the vast majority of people who don't. And so I think that it's important that we look at oppression as something which is structured into class society and which isn't just eternal, which isn't somehow part of human nature. And one of the key texts, which again I won't talk about in any detail now, but is Frederick Engels' work from the 19th century, where he looked at where anthropology was a new science at the time. You'd literally just had Darwin's Origin of the Species about 20 years earlier, and Engels tried to apply this method of having a materialist understanding of how things change in history to the question of class society and oppression in terms of women and the role of the family, and when did this become the case. And for him, for the vast majority of human existence, up until a few thousand years ago, really, maybe 10,000 years ago, people did not live in class societies. People lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers or, foraging societies, which didn't have the kind of hierarchies that we've seen in societies since the last few thousand years. And of course, class societies have existed in lots of different forms over the last 10,000 years. We live in a capitalist society that's, been in existence in Britain for maybe, 300-400 years, and other parts of the globe now, everywhere is really absorbed into the capitalist world. And that has a particular kind of class organisation of society. But I think we still need to come back to that if we really want to understand women's oppression. Because most of the time, women experience sexism and oppression as individuals, and often from individuals. It's not the system, you don't see the system oppressing you every day. But society isn't just a collection of individuals, who have power relationships with each other. It exists on society is organised on the basis of classes of people. A minority class that owns and controls the means of producing wealth in society, that has all the control over how we live, really, and how we feed ourselves and have shelter and so on. And they do that by exploiting the vast majority of people who do not own the means to create wealth, to create their own food and clothing and housing, who have to sell their ability to labour to a boss for a wage. That, you know, of course, that's an oversimplification of society. It's more complicated than that, but that's the fundamental divide in our society. And I think all those other kind of unequal relationships in society, different oppressions and so on, really flow from that central antagonism. Because I think that capitalism needs women to play a particular role, which is a kind of reshaping of the role that women played in previous societies as well. And the gender roles that shape our lives and shape our expectations so fundamentally, I think, flow from that need of the system. The nuclear family in capitalism performs an indispensable role for the system. It feeds and clothes and houses and educates the next generation and the current generation of workers. You know, it allows people to have somewhere to go when they come out of work at the end of the day, to get fed and rejuvenated as much as possible in 12 hours or whatever it is, in order to go back to work the next day. And it does that at a fraction of the cost of capitalism providing those things on a social, kind of socialised basis. Though, of course, lots of different parts of those caring roles are actually performed by wage labourers as opposed to being performed for free in the home, you know, by mothers mostly. Because the family as an institution, in general, it translates into women taking the vast majority of that responsibility. And I don't think that's because all men in those families are sexist. I think it's because our society is so set up for that to be the way it functions, that it's very hard to live in any other way. Of course, people do try and people do manage it to some extent. But, you know, I know that my sister gave up work when she had children because her partner's income was higher than hers, and that's likely to be the case in most cases in this country. And so if one of them was going to look after the children, it made more sense for it to be her because they would lose less income in the household, you know, etc., etc. You know, and you end up replicating the life that you never planned to have and you thought you weren't going to do, because it's just quite hard to not do that in a society that is completely geared towards the nuclear family in a house with its own washing machine and a, you know, etc., etc. And when childcare is as expensive as it is, you know, £1,000 a month apparently to have a young child looked after, then, you know, these decisions aren't easy to make for anyone. It's very difficult to reject that situation. But I think the fact that women have to take on that caring role really is still the reason that women think of themselves, whether consciously or not, and are thought of by others as the ones who are going to be caring, the ones who are going to be friendly, willing to please, smiling all the time, as well as being sexually desirable, as well as being fertile, you know, and about to play that role in society. And men, of course, raised to be in the outside world, to be the breadwinners, to be the rational, logical ones who are good with money, or, you know, all of these things. And confident and outgoing. And women are meant to be in the home, and so it doesn't really matter if they're confident and outgoing. It sounds, you know, silly when you reduce it to those kind of stereotypes, but I really think it does underlay the way that these kind of, you know, the more everyday stuff that people have talked about more recently is still shaped by that reality. The fact that women do tend to feel less comfortable in public, take up less space, be quieter, that men might feel it's more their space, even if they don't realise they're thinking that they spread out, that they are confident, etc., etc., all of those things. And I think it's also underlies why women are still treated as sexual objects, and why that can be exploited and acted upon by some men in terms of harassment, assault, and so on. But we, you know, as much as you have to challenge individual behaviour, I think we also have to always recognise that the real beneficiary of this oppression is the system as a whole, which gets all of that free labour from women, really. I think an oppression that's so deeply rooted in the economic system will take a fundamental transformation to uproot. And I think that starts with challenging, sexism and the bullying culture that allows harassment to take place. I think when you think about the Weinstein crisis and all the further revelations about Hollywood, and think about the kind of workplace that is, very individualised, no overarching organisation, no collective organisation of, the workers on the ground. Often people are freelance, self-employed. All of these things make it easier to attack, individual women, for them to feel isolated, and so on. And I do think that collective organisation is really what we need to look to in terms of right now, how you challenge those kind of cultures in a workplace. During the Weinstein stuff coming out, the American journalist Barbara Ehrenreich tweeted that, it's so class-based, there's too much talk about actresses and not enough about hotel housekeepers. And I think that's a fair point, because if you think about the Weinstein stuff, it's all about women going to his hotel room on their own. Hotel housekeepers, cleaners, that's literally their job, having to go into hotel rooms on their own and, routinely facing harassment, really. And the same goes for cleaners, for waitresses, all kinds of, again, lots of jobs which are related to women's roles in society are also those that are often most isolating, and so on. I just want to finish by, jumping back to the Russian Revolution for a second, because one of the things that was really notable then was that it was exactly these same groups of women workers, waitresses, laundry workers, domestic servants, who were part of some of the most inspiring struggles during that year in 1917. There's a book called Midwives of the Revolution, which I don't think is in print, but you can read it online, that looks at the struggles by women. You had something like 40,000 laundry workers, women, who went on strike in the May of 1917, so it's after the Tsar has fallen, but before the October Revolution. And one of the incredibly important things was that they challenged the idea of what they were meant to be like. People thought that laundry women were meek and kind of lowly and not, there wasn't a lot of respect for them in society. And actually after several weeks on strike, people had changed their idea of what laundry women could be like. The following month, waitresses went on strike across Russian cities, and one of the key demands was about being referred to by the formal form of you rather than the informal, because informal is like calling a waiter boy or whatever. It's an insult, it's demeaning, and they were asserting their dignity, really. Factory workers, women factory workers, demanded an end to body searches, which would take place, when they came and when they left the factory. Workers, men and women, would be searched, so that's intrusive in its own right, but of course for women that entails an added level of sexual humiliation, of potential assault, and so on. And they fought against that because they were fighting for this basic dignity. And I think if you can see that in a society like Russia in 1917, which was so backward, women were barely considered human, fully human, they actually organised collectively against their oppression, and in doing that they changed the minds of the men around them, but also they became a bigger part of the wider struggle for a different kind of society. I think the fact that a century on we can see the same kinds of women, women in the same kind of roles in society, tells us that we have to keep fighting the same battles if we don't completely overthrow the system. And I think that's the final thing, really, because there's a logic of capital which will reassert itself unless we challenge and end that whole logic, and that logic's broken.